Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome to yet another episode of the Examined Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. This would be episode, I think we're up to 63 now. I'm really surprised this has gone on as long as it has. I had no idea back when Dr. Mahfood asked me to start doing this podcast that I'd wind up doing so many. So anyhow, this week I'm going to do another bit in my series I'm doing on creation, evolution, and science, and I'm going to give a presentation on Old Earth Creationism, on why I think the Earth is relatively old, about 3 or 4 billion years old, and the universe is probably, I forget the dating, either like 11 or 14 billion years old, and why I think that it's perfectly compatible and reasonable to believe that, and also take the first couple of chapters of Genesis seriously and as God's Word. So I'm going to do a whole presentation on that, and I'm going to do it. I don't have a guest because that's the viewpoint I hold, so you'll get to hear from me. But before I get into that, it's been quite a long time since I've done a facepalm and sigh segment with all the interviews and stuff I've been doing with people. Those have kind of got pushed to the side. And, a lot of people have been saying some pretty wacky and stupid things. I've got like a whole backlog of websites and articles and stuff where I'm like, yeah, this is just such a good candidate for facepalm and sigh award. So this week I'm actually going to do... I'm going to give out a Facepalm and Sigh Award in relation to 2 articles, because they're actually both pretty similar, although one's a little bit more nuanced of an issue than the other one. So the first one, this comes from an article that CNN published on January 30th. It's called Coronavirus Task Force, Another Example of Trump Administration's Lack of Diversity. And it shows some pictures of President Trump meeting with I guess like the team he or somebody in his administration put together to deal with the coronavirus, and then compares it to the team President Obama had put together to deal with the Ebola virus. And the person is complaining that when you look at Trump's team, it's pretty much a bunch of white guys and a couple of women, where when you look at President Obama's, there's some women, some white guys, some African Americans, and kind of just more of a mix. And so this article was written by Brandon Tensley, and again, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the name, and he says, it's a statement that's as predictable as it is infuriating. President Donald Trump's administration lacks diversity. On Tuesday, Trump tweeted photos of a briefing he'd received on the new coronavirus spreading out of China. We will continue to monitor ongoing developments, the president said. We have the best experts anywhere in the world, and they are on top of it 24/7, because everything that Trump says he does is, in his mind, the best thing that's ever. The article continues, who are these experts? They're largely the same sorts of white men and a couple of women on the sidelines who've dominated the Trump administration from the very beginning. By contrast, former President Barack Obama's circle of advisors in the face of the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa was hardly so monochromatic. And skipping ahead a little bit, this person goes on to say that it's partly because of these recent photos of, in quotations, the best experts telegraph the kinds of people the administration deems worthy of holding power and even being in close proximity to it. And again, skipping ahead a little bit, the visuals have come to define the Trump administration and say something else too. They signal which people in a multiracial, half-female country Trump values the opinions of. Mostly white men who mirror images of the president himself. And so obviously Mr. Tensley is complaining that he thinks there needs to be more gender and ethnic diversity in Trump's team of experts who are advising him and other people in the government on how to deal with the coronavirus and what to do. So keep that in mind, and I'm going to relate to you another story that happened. This one actually got reported in several different news organizations. The one I'm looking at is on the InsideHigherEd.com website, called A No-Win Situation. And I'm not going to read this whole article because it's very long. I'll just summarize it for you here. The article's by Greta Anderson. The gist is there was an essay contest held at the University of Montana to honor Martin Luther King Jr. Day and encourage multiracial dialogue that kind of got away and caused a lot of problems, or at least some people think it caused a lot of problems. And so what had happened is the university decided they were going to hold a essay contest in honor of Martin Luther King Day and encourage students, faculty, and other people to send in essays, and they would be evaluated, and I guess the best ones would get, it wasn't really clear if they would get some kind of award or just like be put up like on the school's website on Martin Luther King Day. That part wasn't really clear. Well, what happened is the school's committee that was overseeing this contest picked 4 winning essays, put them up on the school's website on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and then, well, all hell broke loose because it turns out the essays were written by 4 white female college students. And so people were naturally saying, how dare you try to honor Martin Luther King Day by having an essay contest where you pick 4 white people who authored these essays as the winners. Now, the problem is a little more compounded by the fact that when you dig into it a little more and read more in the essay, only 6 essays were submitted for the contest, and no African-American students submitted any kind of essay. In fact, as best as I could tell from the research I did, no minority ethnic group of any kind, nobody from any minority ethnic group of any kind submitted essays there, which this isn't really that surprising if you stop and think about it for a moment. I grew up in Montana. Montana is primarily white and Caucasian. There's very few black people or minorities that live there. In fact, this one article at the InsideHigherEd.com notes that less than 1% of the undergraduates that enrolled at that university are black, only 1.3% are Asian, and 5.4% are Hispanic or Latino. And I think they also note that a little less than 4% might be Native American or Pacific Islander. I don't know why they lump those two together. They're not the same thing. But anyhow, so you've got basically a school that's better than 90% Caucasian or white, so it's really not that surprising that if you hold an essay contest at that school, you're going to get at least a majority of the essays from white and Caucasian students. And the outcries the school is getting on Facebook and Twitter and other types of social media are about the same thing you would always expect. How dare you? That's so racially insensitive. How on earth do you think this is going to do any good? And some people were commenting that white people can't understand what black people go through, etc., etc., etc. Now, again, this ignores the fact that no African-American students actually submitted an essay, which this article on Inside Higher Ed actually goes in and talks a little bit more about that. It's a pretty decent, well-written article where the author kind of tries to dive into everything that's going on instead of just tell you something that's outrageous and then let the people on social media go berserk, which is what usually happens. Now, this essay contest one really sparked my interest because people were coming out against this school for picking 4 essays written by white young women to try to honor Martin Luther King. But if you go back and listen to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, well, we can probably get a little bit of an idea what he might have said about that. And here I'll play you a clip of that pretty great speech he made on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Says, I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Okay, so I hope you could pick out what I remembered from King's speech there is he says, I have a dream that my children won't be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And the people who were obviously so upset and trying to do outcry over this essay contest at the Montana State University, I don't know for certain, but I would be very surprised if any of them actually read those essays and saw what these girls had to say about it. Because at no point in any of the articles I read or looked at did anybody even mention what the content of those essays was. It was all about judging whether or not these authors essentially had the right to speak, to write essays in honor of Martin Luther King Jr., or whether it was like tone deaf that there were no African-American voices included. And to be fair and a little more nuanced, I can totally see how that's a problem. But what's the university supposed to do if they have like 95% Caucasian enrollment and none of the minorities submit an essay? In a certain sense, it's like the university tried and it didn't work, and now the outrage mobs on the internet are saying, well, how dare you try? Because what they're doing is the exact opposite of what King's dream was. They're judging the worthiness of these essays to be presented not by their content, not by the arguments or whatever is or is being written in the essays, but by the mere fact of the color of the skin of the people who wrote them. Which I think we could take from what King's I Have a Dream speech, that is essentially racism, even though these people are decrying the university saying you're doing racist stuff. It actually is the other way around. And now, it's a bit more nuanced in this essay example than it is in the article on CNN, but what this actually is a type of ad hominem argument. Ad hominem is Latin meaning against the man, and it's where you go after somebody not for their arguments, but you kind of attack them and say, you are not worth me hearing, which is what a lot of American society was doing to black people back in the segregationist days. And a lot of people do that to each other in America all the time today. I pointed back out, what was that? When I did the episode, the Facepalm and Sigh Award, the Democratic Debate Edition, this was a couple months ago, it was episode 37, the Democrats were engaging in ad hominem all the time, left and right, when they would say, well, that's a Republican idea, therefore it's wrong. Well, no, just because it's a Republican idea doesn't make it wrong. You've got to actually engage with the idea. So in the case of the essay example, well, are those essays worthy to be considered in honor of Martin Luther King? I have absolutely no idea. I didn't read any of them, and none of the websites reported on the content of them, and from what I understand, the university took them down and took down the pictures of the authors because they were receiving so much backlash about the thing. So what you had is, well, in this case it wasn't against the man, it was against the women because they were all women, but what you had is these authors being judged not by the content of what they wrote, but by the color of their skin, and saying, you're not worthy to be considered in this vein because of the color of your skin. And you have a very similar thing, and it's a little bit, and you have the exact same problem, in fact it's far more blatant, in the case of the CNN article where the guy's saying, how dare President Trump's experts on the coronavirus all be white men? Well, if we're dealing with medical issues and disease transmission and possible outbreaks, I really think what we should be primarily concerned about is whether these are qualified experts. Are these doctors and medical doctors and PhD scientists who have the proper training, experience, and knowledge in these things? That's what should be the primary concern. And if it happens to be the case that, say, a black woman is the best expert in these fields, bring her in and put her on the panel or team or whatever it is, because she's going to be the best person there to advise the president on what to do. If it happens to be the case that it's a white man who's the best expert, who knows the most about all these things and has the relevant experience and training, they should bring him in, because whether or not there's diversity on that panel is not relevant to whether or not it can do its job properly. Its job is obviously to advise the president on what steps they should and shouldn't take and what'll do good, as far as whether or not they need to, say, quarantine a city where there's been a report of an outbreak of the virus or things along those lines. And so what the author of that article did is he kind of tried to do a reverse of this ad hominem by saying, see, these are the experts President Trump brought in. They're people who look like him. Therefore, he's saying none of these other people have value. Well, no, he's not saying that at all. Now, I don't know for a fact that these are the best experts. I don't really know anything about all the medical issues and how to deal with outbreaks and things like that. Maybe a good reporter could actually dive in and look at the credentials of the people who were on President Trump's team versus the credentials of people who were left off and say, well, look, the president excluded all these minorities who were better qualified than the people he had. Well, then you'd have evidence of a problem there. But this author didn't bother to do that. He just flat out committed an ad hominem of saying, President Trump's team on the coronavirus looks a lot like him, therefore racism, i.e., therefore we don't have to listen to them. Therefore, ad hominem against President Trump. And in the case of this CNN article, it's just so blindly obviously stupid that I can't believe CNN actually published this, even though I generally have a fairly low opinion of them. This is really, really dumb. The person is literally saying to a team of people who could, at least potentially, be advising the president on the next major outbreak of disease that could kill millions of people. I mean, maybe it will, maybe it won't. We don't really know that yet. But it potentially could. And he's saying, I don't care what their expertise is. I care if they all don't look alike, or if there's people with different genitals in there, which is just so blindly stupid. This is intersectionality politics run amok to the point where apparently Mr. Tinsley would prefer that rather than having the best qualified people on Trump's panel, he wants people who look a little different, even if that means President Trump is less able to deal with and address a potential outbreak. That's really stupid. What should be on a panel of experts advising the president is the people who have the best expertise. And again, if a good reporter wants to dig into it and determine that, no, President Trump didn't pick the best credentialed people to be on this team, or it's highly doubtful President Trump handpicked these people. He probably had somebody below him. Probably in like the Department of Health and Human Services picked them or something like that. Well, okay, then you've got something there. But as I said, Mr. Tinsley didn't do that. He just says, President Trump's coronavirus team looks too much like him. Therefore, racism, lacking diversity, etc., etc., etc. That's just stupid. So, there isn't one particular person to give the facepalm and sigh award to for the essay contest thing, and as I said, that one's a little more nuanced. You can actually make some arguments that the university could have handled that better, like they only got 6 entries for the contest, so maybe they should have scrapped it, because you got 6 entries and picked 4 winners. Well, I'd say that's fair. That's probably a failure of an essay contest at that point. But with the CNN article, this is just stupid. So I'm giving Brandon Tinsley a facepalm and sigh award for doing a blatant ad hominem attack against Trump's coronavirus team that is just dumb. If President Trump actually was following Brandon Tinsley's advice, it's highly likely he wouldn't have a team of people who were advising him best, because he wouldn't be primarily looking at who's the best expert. He'd be looking at what's the best photo op I can take here that shows that I've got minorities that I'm listening to as well, as opposed to who are the best experts. I don't care what they look like as far as their skin or gender. I want to listen to the best experts. That's the way it should be when you're talking about things like a potential outbreak. Okay, so now moving on to talking about Old Earth Creationism. I am an Old Earth Creationist myself, and what I mean by that is I do think God created the world, as the first couple chapters of Genesis indicate, but I also think that the world is about roughly 4 billion years old, and God created the universe again. I forget the exact date it's put at now, either 11 or 14 billion years ago that the Big Bang was happened. But I accept that God created the world, and that the overwhelming consensus of geology and cosmology that these things are all very old, much, much older than about 6,000 years, is correct. And so I'm going to go through and explain this here. So first of all, it seems to me that the evidence from the hard sciences, things like geology, chemistry, cosmology, and stuff like that, that indicates that the Earth and the universe are really quite old, is very, very strong. It's the overwhelming consensus. Now, expert consensus alone shouldn't be enough to always convince you, but in the case where you don't have the time and skills to go look into it yourself, you can generally go with expert consensus it's fair for you to take it seriously as a warranted belief. So, for example, I've never studied the radioactive decay of certain elements, but I remember from when my wife and I were watching that excellent miniseries HBO did on Chernobyl, one of the main characters was talking to the Soviet Premier Gorbachev on when all this stuff when it'd be safe to be around Chernobyl again, and he says the half-life of this certain element is, I think it was like 10,000 years, so let's just say it won't be safe in our lifetime. Well, I haven't done the study or the research necessary to know, is the decay rate on this particular atom, is the half-life 10,000 years? But, from what I understand, pretty much everybody who is an expert, who has done the research, who has done the experiments, who has looked on it, agrees, the half-life on this element is 10,000 years. So, I would say, in that case, I'm warranted in just going with what the expert says. And really, we all have to do that all the time, take the word of experts on many, many different things. I forget the exact measurement, but you might want to know how far the Earth is from the Sun, or how far the Moon is from the Earth. Well, most of us don't have the time or resources to go do any kind of measurement ourselves, so we go off the expert advice of the astronomers and cosmologists who've done these measurements. And you see the same thing in many, many other kinds of disciplines. The first time I had Peter Razor on the podcast, this was probably about 9-8 months ago, he mentioned that the vast majority of the things we know in virtue of the testimony of others. And that really is the case here. And so in the absence of good cause to doubt the testimony of experts in their fields, and where the experts overwhelmingly agree, I would say you're warranted, that is, it's reasonable for you to believe what these experts are telling you. So here's an example that I hope is relatively non-controversial, but this being the internet, there's people who find ways to make controversy out of, well, pretty much anything, as I just talked about a little earlier. So the overwhelming consensus of archaeologists and Egyptologists who've studied this is that the ancient Egyptians built the Great Pyramid of Giza about 4,500 years ago, give or take a little bit. And in the absence of cause to doubt them, where you can look at it and say, look at the arguments and say, here's where they got this wrong, here's evidence they ignored, etc., etc., I think we're warranted in taking them seriously at that claim. And I like to use this example because there's still questions about like how this could have been done. There's legitimate parts of the issue of how the Egyptians built the Great Pyramid of Giza. There's questions that remain unanswered. But at the same time, the overwhelming consensus of all the experts on this is, the Egyptians did it about 2,500, about 4,500 years ago. Even though there's still some mysteries about it, there's still things we don't quite understand as how they did it. We don't have all the records, but that's the theory that's the best. So I hope that's a less controversial example of how I think this works than things like the geology and cosmology I'm going to get into later. The point here being that if you don't have the time, resources, and skills to go to the Great Pyramid of Giza, do all the dating and all the techniques and stuff yourself, you're justified in taking seriously the consensus of experts there. Now, there's other cases where, say, expert opinion is varied or different, where there's not overwhelming consensus, or where there's evidence that maybe the consensus is wrong. And again, looking at Egypt, the example I like there is the Sphinx is generally regarded by most Egyptologists to have been made roughly the same time as the Great Pyramid of Giza. However, a geologist went there and measured the erosion on the rock that the Sphinx was made out of. I think I've talked about this before on another podcast, and determined that the erosion around there is way too much from a much more humid and wet climate than the way the climate would have been when the Great Pyramid of Giza was being built. So he disputes that date and says that originally the Sphinx was something different, probably a larger statue that had gotten weathered down, and it was probably recarved at the time of the Great Pyramid of Giza, give or take a little bit. So that's how you get dating discrepancies there. And in that particular case, I would look at that and say, well, there isn't as much consensus here because you have another expert. A geologist is an expert as far as rocks go, even though he's not an archaeologist. So he's an expert that you can look to as far as weathering patterns on rocks. And he's saying, no, the dating on this one is off, versus the traditional standard view of the archaeologists and Egyptologists. And so there I say, well, you're probably not at least as warranted in taking the consensus view of the archaeologists and the Egyptologists seriously, because you've got another expert who's giving a disputing claim. And so, tying this all back into creation and science and things along those lines, what I have found when I'm talking to young Earth creationists, like Scarlett, who I had on, this is probably about 2 months ago I had her on the podcast now. Anyhow, what I've found is they will usually dispute the idea that you can take seriously the consensus of experts and call that appeal to authority. But what they don't understand is appeal to authority is not always a fallacy. You want to know how to deal with nuclear physics and how to build the nuclear power plant? Appealing to a nuclear physicist is not a bad appeal to authority. That's a very good appeal to authority. You want to know what Plato meant when he was writing, say, the Republic? Go talk to a guy who's got a doctorate in philosophy and is a well-known Plato scholar. Not a bad appeal to authority. Appeal to authority is only fallacious when you're appealing to someone who is not an authority in that field. From talking to some other philosophers about this, an appeal to authority is warranted if it is the case that, in the event that you would go and do all the research, get the education, and do all the stuff yourself, you would come to the same conclusion. Appeal to authority is basically a shorthand for saying, here's what we can know about this, and rather than spending 15 years of my life and writing hundreds of pages of dissertations going through and proving all this myself, I'm going to just stand on the shoulders of the 300 people who've done it before me and just go with what they say, because we all have limited lives and I need to get on with my life. I don't have the time to research and thoroughly document everything, so I'll go with what the experts say when I don't have cause to doubt them. So appeal to authority is not necessarily fallacious. It's only when you're appealing to authority who's speaking out of his subject matter, like when people appeal to Richard Dawkins for philosophy, or when somebody might appeal to a Christian philosopher for things in quantum physics. In that case, they're appealing to the wrong authority. Or in the case where the authorities themselves are divided, where there isn't a consensus opinion, which, from what I understand, is the case in a lot of things with quantum physics. There's some things where there's strong consensus, but lots of other things where the experts themselves don't agree. So appealing to a quantum physicist for his opinion on quantum physics, well, probably not as warranted because there's not consensus in the field. Or as I said, in the case where there's some good cause or evidence that would lead you to reasonably suspect the authorities are probably wrong on this one, like the example of the weathering on the stone enclosure of the Sphinx. Okay, so now that I've kind of laid that groundwork about when we are and aren't warranted about these types of beliefs and what the fallacy of appeal to authority both is and is not, I'll go ahead and say again that just the vast overwhelming consensus of pretty much all the hard sciences, from like geology, chemistry, plate tectonics, radiology, and so on and so forth, is that there's just a very large body of evidence that all points to the Earth being quite old, around 4 billion years, certainly much, much older than around 6,000 years at least. And for example, here are the kind of things I'm referring to. You have rock strata wherein the layers were laid down, usually by water or the other processes of time, and just set as rock. That's what sedimentary rock is. And then plate tectonics and other forces would push those rocks back up again, as like mountains and things along those lines. Then those rock layers that were pushed up into the mountains were cut down again by like erosion through glaciers and water and things along those lines. And thus there on the face of it, you have a process that just takes a whole lot longer than just a couple of thousands of years, and you can just see that. Go to a place like Glacier National Park and look at the mountains there, which were cut by glaciers in the last ice age, and you can see this immense amount of rock strata all the way up and down. It's obviously something that's going to take just much, much longer than a couple of thousand years, and that's what the geologists tell us. You also got things like starlight from stars that are millions and even billions of light years away that have reached Earth. And thus, this will strongly argue that those stars were there billions of years ago giving off light. I mean, even if the Earth wasn't here billions of years ago, those stars were there in the universe because it's taken that many billion years for the starlight to reach the Earth. We also got things like ice core samples from Antarctica and Greenland that go back to around 800,000 years. Now, there's some discrepancy in the dating method here. That is, they'll date it by they'll do stratification of the ice as well, and then they'll also date it by the gas in the ice, but that discrepancy only comes out to be like about 1,000 years, so you're still looking at way, way more than 6,000 years. We can even do just tree ring dating back to around 12,000 years, or a little less than 14,000 years, depending on the source you look at there. Tree ring dating is every year a tree grows, it adds a little ring, and so you can cut open the trees and see the rings inside. And because you get a larger ring in a wet, really large growing season and a smaller one in a smaller season, scientists who compare this can then figure out where these tree rings overlap and actually push it back, the dating back to around 12 to 14,000 years. There's also the evidence of decay rates of radioactive elements. That is, certain elements will decay at certain rates into other elements. This is how you get carbon-14 dating, because carbon decays at a certain rate, becomes something else, and so what they'll do is measure how much of the carbon is left, how much of the other stuff is left, and from that you can get an estimate of how long that thing has been there, how long it's been decaying. And it's an imperfect system because, I mean, other things can come in and contaminate it, and it's not going to give you, like, precise down to, like, the second or the hour dating because it's not meant to do that. It's only going to give it to you in a range of, I think, like, millions of years, but it's still something you can use where you can say, look, radioactive decay rates are constant. So if we know it started off with this much carbon and now there's this much carbon left, this will allow us to estimate roughly how long ago this animal lived or something along those lines. And you can do the exact same thing with other types of elements that have stable decay rates. And I don't study radiology, but my understanding is there are some elements that have stable decay rates and others that don't have stable decay rates, and you can just, so obviously they only use the ones with stable decay rates in dating things like this. Now, as I'm sure you recall, when I was talking to the young Earth Creationist guest I had on Scarlet, I put all this evidence to her, and she, the basic response she had is that all of these assume simply the uniformity of the past, and that's the term that she was using. And in a certain sense they do, but rejecting the uniformity of the past is, I want to say, quite irrational, and it's a type of skepticism that's pretty much in line with the irrational skepticism that David Hume proposed. Well, some Humean scholars don't think he was quite that skeptical, that he was like kidding or being, I don't know, speaking in jest sometimes and things along those lines, but surface level reading of David Hume is he's extremely skeptical in ways that are often contradictory and self-refuting. So anyhow, the point here is, if you're going to claim that things were different in the past, then you're going to need to have some evidence for that claim. Because assuming that things tend to work the same is the basis of all human reason. It's the basis of the regular laws of logic. I go around claiming things like there are no square circles, there are no married bachelors, per the law of non-contradiction, or per the law of excluded middle, things are either or not. It's either raining or it's not. Somebody is alive or dead, not both and not at the same time, so on and so forth. And in a certain sense, a la David Hume, it's fair to say I'm kind of assuming that these basic laws of logic apply everywhere all the time. If you really want to be ultra-skeptical, you could push me to the point where I would say, yes, I am assuming that these basic laws of logic apply everywhere all the time, because that's the only way I can see to make sense of the world, and it does seem to work all the time, as best as I can tell. I've never found an event, time, phenomena, or instance where the laws of logic don't apply, where they suddenly don't work anymore, where it just isn't the case that contradictions don't exist. And that's the way we all have to do reasoning, is find out what the standard is and apply it everywhere all the time. And sometimes we get the standard wrong, and then we have to revise things. That's part of what doing good logic is. That's how logic has advanced since Aristotle gave those first three laws. That's why you had people like Leibniz trying to argue for a fourth law, the principle of sufficient reason. That's why you have modal logic today, is because people were trying to see, well, how else can we consistently apply this standard of human reasoning to everything? That's why in the early 20th century, there was a whole group of logicians in Britain and Europe who were attempting to try to find ways to advance logic, because they were looking around and going, well, does the standard we're working from apply everywhere and work all the time? And if they could find a place where it didn't, then they try and revise their model and go on. And that's the way we have to always go about thinking about things, is look for uniformity. This is the exact reason why when you're arguing with somebody about something and they say something that's inconsistent, like say you're arguing with your significant other and they'd said before, I don't like it when you argue with me in this particular way. And then in this argument, they start arguing in that particular way that they told you before they don't want you to argue in. Well, you might turn around and cry, aha, inconsistency, you can't do that. And that's because we all recognize life needs to be consistent, at least in some senses, for things to make sense. There has to be uniformity in order for things to be rational and reasonable. And so if you're going to reject this idea of the uniformity of the past, which is absent other causes or reasons, the past is going to be pretty much like what the present is, and same thing for the future. Absent other causes or reasons, the future is going to be pretty much like what the past is. That is, I think that the sun rose in the east and set in the west every day the earth has been here, and I think it will rise in the east and set in the west every day the earth is here in the future, for as long as the earth is here. And if it doesn't do that one day, it's going to be because something very odd happened that made the world stop spinning, or the sun went supernova, or something crazy like that. But those things aren't going to just happen without some other kind of outside influence acting on it. I don't know. I seem to remember seeing a sci-fi show or two where somebody shot a missile or something into a star that made it go supernova. So maybe something like that happens. Well, okay, but then you've got a reason why this is happening, why it's no longer uniform. And so here's the point I'm making. If you're going to make this claim that all of this evidence depends on the uniformity of the past, well, in a certain sense, all of David Hume, if you want to be that skeptical, you're right. But there's only really two ways you can do this. You either have to be all extremely skeptical like David Hume, in which case I'm going to come back and claim you're not being reasonable anymore because you will take this idea of uniformity and apply it in other parts of your life, but then you're going to reject it in this one instance, which is obviously not consistent and obviously that's irrational. Or, in turn, you have to find other evidence that indicates why this isn't uniform, why in this particular case the past was not like what's going on today. And so I think when I was talking with Scarlett, we mentioned the example of Mount St Helens eruption back in the early 80s in Washington State. Well, you had lots of strata being laid down very quickly there. My understanding is you even had petrified trees, essentially, form very, very quickly in one of the lakes that the volcano flooded with all its lava and ash and stuff. And so there you see a case where, well, what happened was very, very different than the uniformity we would expect. I mean, this is Mount St. Helens eruption is in the past now, so I can look back at that and go, well, that is an event where the uniformity of the past didn't really apply. Things were happening much, much more quickly. But at the same time, there's all kinds of evidence as to why it wasn't uniform then. We have all the evidence that there was a massive volcanic eruption where the volcano literally blew like half of the mountain away and buried all kinds of things really quickly. And so there we have a reason to say, this is why this past event is not like a typical past event. And so, for another example, my geology on this might be a little out of date. Maybe the theories have moved on or advanced, but I think the general theory is that the Grand Canyon was formed rather gradually by the Colorado River, just carving it out over a long, long period of time, possibly millions of years. Well, let's suppose instead that somebody found a good deal of evidence that somewhere upriver from the Colorado River, somewhere upriver from where the Colorado River goes to the Grand Canyon, there used to be a bunch of very, very large ancient lakes, and further they found like fossils or something that indicated these lakes dried up very, very quickly. Well, that would be evidence that indicates, hey, maybe the Grand Canyon wasn't formed gradually, but by a rapid amount of water moving through there very, very quickly. There was like a massive flood or something, similar to what Rob Rowe and I were talking about with Noah's flood. Well, there you'd have a reason, you'd have evidence to say, aha, here's why this particular instance isn't uniform. Here's why in this particular instance it happened very quickly, as opposed to gradually like we typically would see. And so let me sum up again. What I'm claiming here is, if you're going to claim that all of this evidence depends on the uniformity of the past and then reject it, there's really only two ways you can go with this. You either have to be employing a very high level of skepticism inconsistently, because I know people who I talk to who are young Earth creationists attempt to appeal to the basic rules of logic, and good for them. But they're not that skeptical of the basic rules of logic as they are of the uniformity of the past. They're being inconsistent in their levels of skepticism. Or, conversely, you have to then turn around and point to some other evidence as to why it is the case that, in the example of Glacier National Park, it didn't take hundreds of thousands or millions of years for the rock strata to get laid down, get pushed back up again by plate tectonic forces into mountains and then cut through by glaciers. Because that's how it typically looks when you just go look at it. There really isn't any other evidence that it happened very, very quickly. There's not evidence of like a massive dry lake bed somewhere that just came through and just carved out all these mountains or something like that. The evidence is that it happened relatively slowly over thousands of years due to glaciation, and then before that you had, again, relatively slowly, mountains pushed up by plate tectonics, and then before that the rock strata laid down by sedimentation and stuff like that over time. And that's as opposed to the examples like I cited of Mount St. Helens, where, yeah, these things happen very, very quickly, and that's well documented, but you have all this other evidence that indicates, hey, there was a massive volcanic eruption there, and that's why this happened relatively quickly. And generally speaking, you can find evidence of things like volcanic eruptions, asteroid strikes, and other things like that cause these changes to happen really very quickly, even if you're dealing with events that are hundreds of thousands or millions of years in the past. So there are some instances where claiming, hey, the past isn't uniform, things happen much quicker here, much slower here, where that's warranted, but only when you have evidence that that's the case. Otherwise, you're quite well warranted and justified in assuming, yeah, the past is pretty much like the present and the future will be pretty much like the present. The same basic rules of logic and nature and all this kind of stuff apply 6,000, 10,000, 100,000, 100 million years ago as do today. And generally speaking, when I've listened to young Earth creationists attempt to give explanations for these things, I'm yet to find any good explanations for all of this. Like sometimes they might be able to make a offhand point because no system is perfect. There's no system that you could ever look at that doesn't have at least some kind of quirk or something about it where you're going to go, well, that's kind of an issue. And it's the same thing with geology, even though geology is one of the harder and more certain sciences. There's always places where you can find, there's always places where you can find a little problem or something that would make a reasonable person go, that piece doesn't quite fit. But you don't have near as much of that in things like geology as you do in things like, say, social science and philosophy and theology. That's why geology and chemistry and other things like that are considered a hard science, because there's so much good certainty in them. So I say this as somebody who used to be a young Earth creationist, who's read a lot of their materials, who's been involved in these discussions for a while, but I'm just unaware of any meta objection that young Earth creationists can apply to all this various kind of data that indicates the world is really old, because you have rock strata, which is from geology, you have starlight, which is from cosmology, you have tree ring dating, which is from biology, or maybe paleontology in some cases. You have paleontology itself when you look at dating of fossils through carbon-14 and things like that. You have radioactive decay rates, which is radiology. You've got all these various not related disciplines that are pointing to more or less the same dates in many of these cases. And so that's why I say the physical evidence for the world being much, much older than 6,000 years is quite overwhelming and quite strong. And really, the only reason I've ever found that anybody would deny this is if they think the Bible claims that God created the world about 6,000 years ago, and they also think that the Bible is inerrant or without error. Now, as people who listen to this podcast know, I just did a whole big debate on inerrancy about a little more than a month ago now, and I do think the Bible's without error. But this type of thinking is at best a gross oversimplification, and I'll explain some more. But the chief point here is, absent the Bible, absent these people thinking the Bible claims that the world was created about 6,000 years ago, they really wouldn't have any problem with the idea that the world is 3 or 4 billion years old. At least I find it hard to see how they could. The only people who do claim that the world is about 6,000 years old are people who think that the Bible says it was created 6,000 years ago. You, generally speaking, at least none that I'm aware, you don't find any single scientist who works in these fields who doesn't also happen to be a young Earth creationist making this claim. And so this ties into various problems with interpretation, inerrancy, things that I'd talked about before in the debate on inerrancy in my follow-up podcast to that, and you can go back and listen to those if you want to know a little more. I'll just try and do a quick rehash here. The main problem I see here when people will look at the early chapters of Genesis and conclude this is teaching that the world is only 6,000 years old is that they're kind of locked into a binary thinking that's inappropriate here. Now, binary thinking is not always wrong. There are many questions that we can look at that are binary. Does God exist or doesn't he? Well, that's a binary question. Did God create the universe or didn't he? Again, binary question. The answer is clearly yes or clearly no. But the problem is that unless it's written in a very precise way, regular language and literature often doesn't fall into simple binary categories like this. So here's a good question to illustrate this point. I want you to ask yourself, is the movie that's now about, 12 years old, is the movie 300, is it true? Now, you should immediately struggle to answer that question because the answer isn't really binary. In some senses, the movie 300 is true, and in some senses, it's not. There there really was a battle at Thermopylae where King Leonidas led 300 soldiers, and they had a last stand against the Persians, and it inspired all of Greece, and it is a really, really cool story. But the retelling of the story in the movie 300, well, not exactly true. There were more than 300 soldiers there. The Spartans didn't fight not wearing armor and just red capes. They were heavy infantry. They wore lots of armor. And the movie exaggerates a lot of details and gets many details wrong pretty much on purpose, because the whole point of that movie is to try to tell the story in the coolest way possible, which it does. It is a pretty cool movie. So it's not as simple to say yes or no to the question, is the movie 300 true? Because in some senses, yeah, it is, and in some senses, it's not. It's a true story told in an ultra-stylized way, so it's a true story, but that telling of the story has many elements that aren't true. Another example is that, if I remember my history right, King Leonidas was actually pretty old when he led those Spartans off to make their last stand. I think he was in his 50s or 60s, if I'm remembering correctly. And so the problem I'm pointing to is very often young Earth creationists like to pit the early chapters of Genesis as an all-or-nothing affair. That is, it's either all completely literally true, or it's false. But this just completely ignores how regular language and literature work. You can say a false thing poetically, and people often do. Or you could say a true thing poetically, and people often do, and it's not necessarily false. So reading the first chapter of Genesis, at least prima facie, it could well be the case that the author of Genesis, and I'll just say it's Moses for the sake of argument here. I think it probably was Moses. I know some biblical scholars disagree and think it wasn't, but I think it probably was, and that's not an argument I want to get into here. So anyhow, reading that, you could well say Moses intended us to read it as though God was creating the world in 6 24-hour days. It could also be the case that his point is that God created the world, and a la something like 300, he's stylized it in the case of organizing the story in the realm of God creating it in 6 days to attempt to make theological points. And if that's what Moses did, then it wouldn't be false to say, hey, it's the story of God creating the world, but it's told with literary devices and poetics and things like that, so it wasn't the case that it was created in 6 24-hour days. So then the appropriate question we need to ask is, well, what was Moses' intention there? Was he intending to communicate God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days at an approximate date about 6,000 years ago, sometime around 4,000 BC, give or take a little bit, depending on who does the dating? Or was he trying to say something else? Now, the one thing I think that everybody who reads it should be able to agree on is that one of Moses' main points, or the main point, is God created the universe and the world, God created humankind, God created all the animals, and God's the ultimate authority here who created everything. That's the point we can all take away from Genesis, irregardless of what else is going on. Now, again, this is something that I've talked about quite a bit over the last couple of podcasts, so I'll just go through it quickly here. But the best possible interpretation of any text, whether we're talking about Scripture in Genesis or something else, is one that will fit with the patterns of evidence of the text, that it's coherent, it's plausible given the context of the writing itself, and the culture and background, and it is the author's intention, or at least it's as close as we can get to the author's intention. And the example I love to use, because it works so well, is that of people who attempt to apply like feminist and especially second and third wave feminist interpretations to Shakespeare's plays. Because there are ways to make that fit with some of this criteria. You can make those interpretations coherent. You can find evidence in the text for them if you look hard enough. But they're not plausible given the context of the writing itself when Shakespeare was writing, the culture and background in which the author Shakespeare was writing. And so we can look and say, well, that's definitely not in keeping with Shakespeare's intentions. He didn't mean for his plays to be interpreted this way, even though it fits some of the other criteria there. Now, as I said before, it's very clear that Moses' primary intention in Genesis is to establish that God created the world and is supreme over all of it. Now, another thing that we could say, if Moses really was the author, and again, I think he probably was, is that Moses certainly didn't witness the creation himself. He's not writing down what he himself witnessed. So then you are left with two options as to how he's got the story of Genesis to tell. He's either repeating a cultural or religious tradition that he received from his elders and his fathers before him, or you have God directly telling him what to write. Now, since I go with a supervision scripture theory, I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think God did inspire Moses to write Genesis, and I think he is repeating a tradition that's been passed on to him by his forefathers and elders as well. And another point of evidence in favor of this is, it does seem to me that the first couple chapters of Genesis, especially before you get to Abraham, they don't tend to have a lot of superfluous details. That is, details that aren't really central or important to the story. If you look in the Gospels, you see superfluous details all over the place. Like, it tells you what type of tree that Zacchaeus climbed. Or it will tell you that the grass was really green when Jesus was feeding the 5,000. The Gospels are filled with all kinds of little details like that aren't really important to the central theme or point of the story. And as many people have argued, that's one of the reasons why we can actually, to some extent, fact-check the Gospels and realize, oh wait, there really were sycamore trees in Jericho when Christ would have been there. And on and on and on we can go. But go back and look at the early couple chapters of Genesis, and at least up to Abraham, I mean, maybe you can see some superfluous details in Noah's story a little bit, but not much. It's only about the time you get to Abraham that you start seeing a lot of those types of details pop up in the story. And if people are telling you a narrative, you tend to get more of the superfluous details like that. And that's one of the ways you can turn around and fact-check stories like that. When police officers are investigating crimes or murders and they're interviewing suspects, that's one of the things they look for are these offhand details that the person said but wasn't really thinking about? Do those match up with his story? Do those match up with the other stories? And that's one of the ways you can do this type of investigation. But the first couple chapters of Genesis, for the most part, they don't really have those. It's like the story in those couple chapters has been whittled down to its absolute bare essentials. And this isn't like a dead certain thing, but that's kind of what you would expect if it's a tradition that had been repeated for a long, long period of time until it got to Moses' hand when he wrote it down. Whereas in the case of Abraham, Abraham would have predated Moses by about 400 or 500 years. They were in bondage for 400 years, and then Abraham, probably by about 500 years, there wouldn't be as much time for all those superfluous details to get whittled down, so you start seeing more of those in the text. And so that's evidence, I think, that the first couple chapters of Genesis are a tradition that Moses had received from his culture and society and wrote them down. Now, additionally, it does seem to me that the first couple chapters of Genesis are a very odd beast as far as what the genre they are. When you start reading Genesis and you get to Abraham, I think it's very clear at that point that's intended as historical narrative. You get a little bit of that when you're talking about, say, Noah and the Tower of Babel. Again, it seems pretty clear, at least to some extent, that's also intended as historical narrative, where when you start looking at the first couple chapters of Genesis, there's also there's parts of it that are very much narrative-like, but then there's also parts of it that seem more poetic, more stylized, more like the movie 300, essentially. So just here's a couple of examples. There's that refrain that it was evening and morning the first day, each time God creates something. Now, when I was talking to Scarlett, that's one of the things she pointed to say, see, it was a single day. Single days have evening and morning. But a refrain is also a poetic device that shows up. It's something that shows up in songs and hymns and things like that all the time, or chants. There's also the parallelism of the days, where God creates the space for something, and then 3 days later, he creates the things that populate that. So he creates the waters 3 days and land, and 3 days later he creates the fish and the animals, and so on and so forth. There's the fact that the light is created before the sun. And even the early church fathers noted that this is a very odd thing, that the light would be created before the sun, because even in 100, 200 AD, these people weren't stupid, and they realized light comes from the sun. So how is it that light was created before the sun? There's the fact that Adam's name is the Hebrew word for man, and thus even Adam is clearly intended as a stand-in for all men, even if he was an actual historical figure. So there you've got a poetic thing going on where the man in the story is literally called man. Well, if you translate that into English as just man, that would be almost be a little bit too on the face of it, so to speak. We tend to like a little more subtlety in our English stories than that. So maybe that's part of the reason why people miss this point, that Adam is clearly intended as a stand-in for all men. We also see this same point made in the New Testament as Paul talks about Christ being the second Adam. And Paul also says that death reigned from Adam to Moses, but clearly people didn't stop physically dying after Moses came. And again, as another example of this, I mentioned before there's the lack of superfluous details in the first couple chapters. And that's, again, more evidence to me that something about this has been poeticized or stylized, because when you get historical narrative, you find superfluous details like this, and you just don't see those for the most part in the first couple chapters of Genesis. You start getting a little bit of them when you get into Noah's story, maybe a little more in the Tower of Babel, and then when you get to Abraham, there's tons of them everywhere, and it's clearly intended as historical narrative. But when you look at Genesis 1, 2, and 3, it's a little bit iffier. It doesn't really work the same way. And so it seems to me that what we have in the first couple chapters of Genesis based on this is we have a true story that's probably being told in a very thematic way to make theological points, because the Bible is a theology book. It's meant to teach us about God. And so I think we have a true story here that God created the world and is sovereign over it, and he's the ultimate authority, that's being told in a stylized and thematic way in order to make some theological points. And as I talked about before, you can tell a true story in a very thematic way. Look at the example of 300. It's a very good example of that. Or you can look at the many, many films that have been made about Christ's life and how they're vastly, vastly different. There was one that was popular when I was a kid. I think it was made in the 70s, called Jesus of Nazareth. Well, compare that to Mel Gibson's The Passion. Very, very different movies, very different in theme and tone and level of violence. But they're both true stories. They're both about Christ's life and death on earth. And you see even the same thing in the gospel accounts of Christ, where you have Mark having Jesus do things that he doesn't do in Matthew and Luke, and you even have the Gospels repeating stories in different orders and doing all kinds of weird things like that, because the authors are rearranging the details in order to make theological points. And so for these reasons, when I read the first couple chapters of Genesis, I see Moses telling me God created the world. God is sovereign over it. God organized and put all these things and put an order in creation. God gave man a sense of dominion over creation in order to use it, tame it, and rule over it. Man messed this up and fell, and almost certainly it is the case that it was an actual physical man and woman, Adam and Eve. I kind of like the theory that Michael Jones espoused, that the Garden of Eden was the proto-temple where God called a man and a woman to serve as his first priest and priestess, and they messed it up, and that's how we got the fall. I think that's a reasonable theory. I'm not 100% committed to it, but it fits with the text and the evidence we have. But what I don't see when I read these first couple chapters of Genesis is a date that says, therefore it happened 6,000 years ago. And I know what everyone who is a young earth creationist wants to appeal to for that is the genealogies. But the problem with that is, it's very obvious when you go read the genealogies, genealogies are not intended to be used as a dating mechanism. If you can date it from that, it's at best an offhand evidence. It's like one of those superfluous details that you can use to fact-check things. It wasn't the author's intention to give you a date of creation by giving you these genealogies with the ages of the patriarchs. Now, other people have done some good work as far as the symbolism of the genealogies in Genesis, and so I'm just going to play you a clip of a YouTube guy who I look at, who's a biblical scholar on this. His YouTube channel is Ben S., and this is from the video Why Biblical Scholars Don't Take the Creation Museum Seriously, because he's just going to explain and summarize this a lot better for you than I can. So here is that clip.
The CEO of the Creation Museum has rebuked the senior editor at BioLogos for doubting the literalness of the lifespans of the patriarchs in Genesis. But I think Ham spoke too quickly here. Clearly the lifespans of the patriarchs do involve mathematical contrivance and symbolism. The Bible itself is pretty blatant about this. In the genealogy in Genesis 5, for example, we are given 30 figures. They are all divisible by 5, or end in a 2 or a 7. With the single exception of Methuselah, whose age can be derived by adding multiples of 5 and 7. These sorts of statistics don't occur at random. That's not my theological opinion, it's math. The probability that Genesis 5 represents a natural genealogy has been calculated at 0.0000006%. Moreover, subtract 7 from any of the numbers not already divisible by 5, and they become divisible by 5. Isn't that a strange coincidence? What do I mean by the lifespan figures containing symbolism? I'm saving those for the future as well because there's so much to go through, but here's 2 textbook examples. Enoch, who famously walked with God, is, surprise, the 7th from Adam, and his lifespan was 365 years, the same number of days in the solar calendar, which has Mesopotamian significance. Or take Lamech, the 7th in Genesis 4. He died at 777 years. Genesis 4 also says he would be avenged 7 times, and it's probably not a coincidence that he is the 7th from Enosh, whose name is equivalent to the etymology of Adam. I'll link to a peer-reviewed journal article discussing the numerology of these figures further for those interested.
So the point here, as I see it, is these genealogies were clearly not intended to be taken literally. There's just too much math and symbolism involved. And as he said, the odds of this many people just randomly living to these... the odds of this many people just randomly living to these specific time periods is just so astronomically low, we can't really take that seriously. But even if it was the case that this math and symbolism wasn't there, then I'd still want to say it clearly is the case that Moses, or whoever the author of Genesis was, did not intend for it to be the case that you can take the ages of the patriarchs to date creation. That's clearly not what's going on there. That's clearly not what his purpose is in giving the ages of the patriarchs there. He's trying to establish a line of succession, the way mankind descended from Adam, the way sin carried on, and so on and so forth. I think you could even make a good case that with the ages being symbolic, maybe they're trying to show honor and glory to the great patriarchs who came before him. That is, we're going to honor our great father Methuselah, our great father Enoch, by giving him these ages. It's probably just a way of honoring them, as well as having some theological points in addition to that. And so the point I'm trying to drive home here is that the first couple of chapters of Genesis, they do have some elements that are like history. You have narrative and chronology there. But you have others that are thematic or somewhat poetic, like the symbolism, the parallelism, the way Adam stands in for all men, the refrain, the lack of superfluous details and things like that. So in the first couple chapters of Genesis, it really seems to me you have kind of an odd mix of something that's narrative and a little bit of poetry. I think you have something that is in some sense similar to the movie 300, where you have a true story being told in a very thematic way. Although very different in the case of Genesis than 300. 300 was just trying to look really, really cool. I think Moses arranged that story to attempt to make theological points and to point out the order that God is using in creation. And as I talked about with Robert Rowe, there are many people who will then turn around and argue, well, you have to also read Genesis in its ancient Near Eastern context, and I haven't gotten into that here because there's so much material to cover. But generally speaking, yeah, I'd agree with him there. That's a good way to plausibly go about trying to determine what the author was intending, is to look at the context that the author was in, and Moses was in an ancient Near Eastern context when he was writing. And so you can't just take it as prima facie what it says. You've got to look at what would Moses have meant by this when he was writing. And as has been said many, many times before, and I've tried to argue on podcasts here before, the biblical authors were by no means as literal and precise about things as we are today. Their language and mindset was different than ours is now, and we just have to take that into account. And so that's the primary reason why I think it's perfectly reasonable to read the first couple chapters of Genesis and conclude, there's all kinds of ways you can interpret this that are reasonable, that don't involve a bunch of ad hoc things, that don't involve narrative jumps, that don't involve you not taking this seriously, and conclude God created the world, but it probably wasn't 6,000 years ago. And then take that with the fact that you have this overwhelming level of physical evidence that says the Earth is much, much older than 6,000 years. It's about 4 billion years old. And it seems to me perfectly reasonable to say, yeah, I'm an Old Earth Creationist. God created the Earth, and he did it a lot longer ago than 6,000 years. And now, the reason why I'm not willing to go all the way to being a theistic evolutionist is I still have some skepticism about many aspects of the theory of evolution. If you listen to the other episodes I did with Michael Jones and David Paulman, I'm sure you can pick up on that. I do think some of the evidence is quite good for evolution, but the mechanistic explanations that are generally given for the theory, that is, its mutation and natural selection, and then possibly a few other things, it doesn't seem to me those work. It seems to me that there's something lacking, that's a process that's too slow, that's a process that doesn't overcome the hurdles of how complex biological life is. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all to learn that evolution is true to some extent, but it also seems to me to be a completely inadequate explanation for the vast diversity of life we see and the vast complexity of life we see. I don't see how it overcomes those issues and problems. That's where I'm very, very sympathetic to the critiques of intelligent design proponents. So that's why I don't go all the way to theistic evolution, or as the young Earth creationists would say, that's why I don't compromise all the way. But I don't see any of this as compromise. I see it as using my mind to do the best that I can and look at the evidence and determine what is and is not going on. So that's why I'm an old Earth creationist. As I said, I remain kind of skeptical of some aspects of evolutionary theory, but it does seem to me that the first couple chapters of Genesis can be read reasonably in at least several different ways, which leave the door open for many different interpretations. It seems to me you have a true story there being told thematically, a story that was written in an ancient Near Eastern context at a time very far removed from us, so it's inappropriate to read it and then take it prima facie literally, because it wasn't being written to us prima facie literally. You've got to go back and look at the context in which Moses was writing and what he would have meant by that. And further, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, the just overwhelming consensus of all the hard sciences that we can find converges on the Earth being about 4 billion years old, at least certainly much older than 6,000 years. So, as I said, that's why I'm an old Earth creationist. Now, why don't you write in and let me know what you think? You can always reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or go to the Facebook group I created for the page called The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a search for it, it'll pop up. And leave me a comment and let me know. Do you think Old Earth creationism is a good viewpoint? Do you think it's compromising? Tell me what you think about it. I'll be back again with another podcast next week. I'm not quite sure what it'll be yet. I'm working on a couple different things, but I'll certainly have one up for you then. Thanks for listening.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.